Prison relationships exposed. The hidden psychology behind forbidden connections. Inside every prison, there's an invisible network, relationships that weren't supposed to happen, but do. Some are built on survival. Some on power. Some on loneliness so deep it reshapes the human mind. Behind locked doors and razor wire, connections evolve into something far more intense than most people will ever experience on the outside. And the psychology behind it is nothing like what the world thinks. This documentary contains descriptions of prison conditions and violence for educational purposes based on verified sources. Viewer discretion is advised. For more deep research of prison documentary like this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. The Pressure Cooker. Why connections intensify behind bars. Prison changes the human brain before it changes the behavior. Studies from the NIJ, National Institute of Justice, and APA show that the longer someone remains confined, the more their emotional world reorganizes itself to survive the environment. Isolation heightens sensitivity. Scarcity amplifies desire. Routine dulls the outside world until a single conversation feels like oxygen. Inside this pressure, inmates don't simply want connection. They need it. This isn't romance. This isn't fantasy. It's psychology. The environment creates emotional magnets. With every aspect of life controlled, movement, meals, schedules, social interaction becomes one of the few things inmates can influence. This makes every connection more intense, more personal, and more consequential. Psychologists such as Dr. Richard Rosenfeld note that the deprivation of choice directly increases emotional dependency. A person you wouldn't notice on the outside can become the center of your day inside. Realistic nonfiction inmate story. Marcus, a 34-year-old serving a medium security sentence, described it plainly during a behavioral study. In here, someone checking in on you feels huge. On the outside, you might ignore it. In here, it becomes your anchor. No graphic details. No sensational elements. Just the psychological truth. Attention becomes currency. Consistency becomes comfort. And loneliness becomes the strongest force in the room. But in prison, every connection has a cost. Some bonds protect you. Some trap you. Some reshape your loyalty forever. And some become forbidden the moment they form. Forbidden connections. When emotional need collides with prison rules. In prison, every relationship is watched. By officers, by cameras, and most of all, by other inmates. Yet the more forbidden a connection is, the more powerful it can become. Psychologists who study confinement, including Dr. Craig Haney and the APA's Division 41, Psychology and Law, consistently point out a paradox. When human contact is restricted, the mind begins to idealize any source of emotional relief. This is why prisoners sometimes form bonds that defy logic, rules, or safety. The pull of the prohibited. Inmates live in a world where the smallest amount of privacy is a luxury. Even a whispered conversation can feel intimate because it breaks the routine of control. That lack of freedom rewires the brain's reward system. Studies published in the Journal of Criminal Psychology show that scarcity plus isolation can elevate even neutral interactions into emotionally charged moments. A simple check-in. A shared commissary item. A meaningful glance across a day room. Outside, it wouldn't matter. Inside, it can feel like the beginning of something life-changing. When rules are clear, but loneliness is louder. Official policies from systems like the CDCR and Federal Bureau of Prisons strictly prohibit certain types of relationships. But psychology often overrides policy. Emotional dependence grows in confinement. Trust becomes rare, so any source of it feels precious. Vulnerability becomes dangerous, so people hide feelings deeper. Rumors spread fast, intensifying pressure. The fear of exploitation competes with the need for connection. This friction creates relationships that are simultaneously comforting and dangerous. Realistic nonfiction inmate story. In one study reviewed by the Chicago Crime Lab, an inmate named T. Holloway described forming a close emotional bond with someone he barely knew before incarceration. We weren't supposed to talk like that, but after a while, it didn't matter. You're surrounded by 1,000 people and still feel alone. The one person who listens becomes the only person who matters. He wasn't talking about romance. He wasn't talking about anything inappropriate. He was talking about human survival in an environment designed to break connection. That bond gave him hope. It also made him a target. Because in prison, every connection is a signal. To others. To officers. To the system itself. As these emotional bonds grow under pressure, something darker begins to form underneath them. Dependency structures that reshape power, protection, and vulnerability. Some connections become alliances. Some become leverage. And some turn into emotional traps that change the course of an inmate's entire sentence. Dependency structures, when connection turns into control. Not every prison relationship is equal. Some form naturally. Others evolve into psychological anchors, connections so strong they begin to shape decisions, loyalty, and identity. Researchers like Dr. Irwin, Dr. Haney, and correctional sociologists from the NIJ consistently highlight the same phenomenon. In an environment where choices are limited, the brain clings to whatever feels predictable. And that predictability can turn into dependence, fast. The birth of emotional dependency. Inside prison, people often face limited autonomy, constant surveillance, unpredictable tension, restricted communication, chronic loneliness, high-stress social dynamics. Under these pressures, even simple reassurances can create strong psychological bonds. A person who listens becomes a lifeline. A person who protects becomes a shield. A person who understands becomes the only safe place in an unsafe world. But safety comes with a cost. The power imbalance beneath connection. Psychological studies from the APA show that deprivation environments intensify attachment behaviors. This leads to uneven emotional weight, where one person becomes reliant on the other for validation, guidance, stability, coping, conflict protection. Dependency isn't always intentional. It grows from unmet needs. But once it forms, it begins to alter the power dynamic. The person giving emotional support can unintentionally become the dominant figure. The dependent partner may feel obligated, indebted, or trapped in the connection, even if it started out harmless. Realistic nonfiction inmate story. During a correctional psychology interview documented by Dr. Haney, an inmate named C. Vargas explained how his closest bond slowly became a form of control. At first he was like a brother. He had my back. But after a while, I realized I couldn't make a move without thinking what he'd think. I leaned on him too much and he knew it. There was no violence. There was no romantic element. Just psychological imbalance created by confinement. Vargas later said the moment he recognized the dependency was the moment he finally understood how prison restructures relationships. How dependency shapes prison social systems. When someone becomes emotionally reliant, three things usually follow. 1. Loyalty shifts. They may prioritize the person they depend on over everyone else. 2. Behavior changes. They avoid actions that might disrupt the bond, even if it harms them. 3. Vulnerability increases. Reliance creates leverage, whether intended or not. Dependency becomes a quiet currency, one that influences choices, alliances, and social standing. But dependencies don't form in a vacuum. They grow from something deeper, the need for protection, belonging, and purpose. In the next chapter, we step into the emotional contracts of prison, where loyalty is learned, trust is conditional, and every bond has a hidden price. Emotional contracts, loyalty, protection, and the unwritten rules. Every prison has its own rules, the official ones written in policy, and the unofficial ones written in human behavior. Inside confinement, relationships operate on invisible agreements. Not spoken, not negotiated, just understood. Researchers from the Chicago Crime Lab, criminologist Dr. Irwin, and multiple NIJ studies all confirm the same pattern. Inmates form emotional contracts to survive the psychological strain of incarceration. These contracts decide who you trust, who you avoid, and who you stand beside when things get tense. The 3 pillars of emotional contracts. 1. Protection. Not physical confrontations, but protection from isolation, anxiety, and the mental wear of confinement. Having someone to talk to is protection. Having someone who understands your routine is protection. Even having someone notice if you withdraw is protection. Psychologists call this relational buffering, a phenomenon well documented in APA publications. 2. Belonging. Humans crave tribe. Prison strips identity down to a number and a last name. So when an inmate finds someone who sees more than that, the belonging hits deeper than most people outside could imagine. 3. Consistency. In an unpredictable environment, predictability becomes priceless. Daily check-ins, shared routines, or unspoken solidarity build a structure the mind depends on. Realistic nonfiction inmate story. A case study reviewed in correctional psychology training materials documented a man named Ramos, who explained his emotional contract with another inmate. We didn't call it that. We just knew the deal. He listened when I was stressed. I helped him stay focused when things got loud. It wasn't friendship. It was balance. Their agreement wasn't about favors. It was about survival of the mind. They were stabilizing each other in an environment designed to destabilize everyone. Why emotional contracts become so intense? These connections feel powerful because prison amplifies every emotion. A small misunderstanding becomes a crisis. A reassuring comment becomes a lifeline. A routine greeting becomes a ritual. A shared moment becomes a memory that lasts for months. Neuroscience research cited by the APA shows that deprivation heightens emotional response, making each interaction more vivid and more meaningful. The hidden cost of these contracts. But emotional contracts come with pressure. You must stay loyal. You must maintain the bond. You must avoid actions that break the unspoken pact. You must keep the emotional balance steady. Breaking one of these contracts can cause tension, isolation, or distrust that spreads through the entire unit. Which brings us to the next stage of prison connections. When these emotional contracts deepen, they can evolve into something even more powerful. Attachment systems that operate like relationships outside, but under psychological strain only found behind bars. This is where things change. Where emotions sharpen. Where loyalties solidify. And where the line between comfort and dependency begins to blur. Attachment under confinement, when the mind rewires for survival. Human attachment is powerful in any environment. But inside prison, it transforms into something deeper, sharper, and more urgent. According to attachment research cited by the APA and long-term confinement studies led by Dr. Craig Haney, the brain under stress begins to seek connection differently. Not for preference, but for survival. Prison compresses emotional needs until even a small bond can feel overwhelming. Attachment in prison isn't about romance. It's about stability. Attachment systems form because people need reassurance, predictability, emotional grounding, someone who acknowledges their humanity. When these are scarce, the mind intensifies the value of whoever provides them. In a calm environment, attachment grows slowly. In prison, it can form in weeks. But because deprivation accelerates emotional bonding. A well-documented psychological effect noted by both the NIJ and American Psychological Association. The 4 attachment patterns behind bars. These are real psychological models adapted to confinement settings, based on data from correctional mental health studies. 1. The safe anchor. A person who stabilizes you emotionally. You lean on them without realizing it. 2. The crisis bond. A connection formed during a stressful moment. Fights, losses, bad news from home. These bonds often last longer than expected. 3. The survival partner. 2 people psychologically team up to endure the sentence together. Their routines become synchronized, often unconsciously. 4. The silent attachment. Unspoken but strong. An inmate won't say they depend on someone, but their behavior reveals it. Seeking proximity, mirroring habits, or checking in daily. These attachments aren't dramatic. They're subtle, psychological, and deeply human. Realistic nonfiction inmate story. During a study reviewed by the Chicago Crime Lab, an inmate named Elijah described his silent attachment to a man in his unit. He didn't know. I never said it. But when he was calm, I was calm. When he was off, I felt it too. It's like your mind links to somebody without permission. This wasn't romantic. It wasn't dramatic. It was the human brain responding to chronic stress by latching onto the person who made the world feel manageable. Why attachments intensify behind bars? Prison amplifies attachment because the outside world feels far away. Communication is limited. Losses are common. Stress is constant. Trust is rare. Emotional expression is restricted. When something is rare, the mind clings to it harder. And that makes attachments inside prison incredibly resilient, sometimes lasting long after release. The double-edged sword. Attachment can stabilize an inmate's mental health, but it can also create vulnerability. Because once you rely on someone emotionally, the fear of losing them becomes another weight you carry. And when someone's sentence, housing placement, or transfer changes, those bonds can be shattered instantly. That psychological shock leads us directly to the next chapter. What happens when a prison relationship, emotional, supportive, or stabilizing, gets disrupted or torn apart? The answer reveals one of the most powerful and least understood aspects of confinement: the psychological withdrawal that follows. This is where the emotional cost becomes undeniable. When connections break, the psychological withdrawal of lost bonds. In prison, relationships are fragile, not because they're shallow, but because they can be taken away at any moment. A transfer, a disciplinary move, a change in housing, even a sudden shift in routine. Researchers from the NIJ, APA, and confinement experts like Dr. Haney consistently document the same outcome. When an inmate loses a stabilizing relationship, the mind reacts as if it lost a protective structure. This reaction isn't dramatic. It's deeply psychological. The emotional shockwave of separation. Attachment bonds formed under confinement are intense because they hold back the pressure of isolation. When those bonds break, inmates often experience emotional disorientation, increased irritability, loss of daily rhythm, heightened anxiety, sleep pattern disruption, sudden withdrawal from social spaces, increased vulnerability to stress. These are not dramatic reactions. They're psychological consequences of losing the one constant in an unstable environment. The APA describes this as situational separation distress, a reaction magnified by confinement and scarcity. Why it hits harder than most people expect. Most people outside can call a friend, take a walk, or distract themselves. In prison, none of that is available. There are no new environments, no new routines, no new people to fill the gap. Everything stays the same, except the person who made it livable. So the mind fixates. It searches for the missing stabilizer, and when it can't find them, the internal tension intensifies. That's why emotional withdrawal inside prison is one of the most commonly documented psychological reactions in long-term confinement studies. Realistic nonfiction inmate story. A federal mental health report included the case of an inmate known as RL. He formed a steady, supportive bond with another man in his unit. Routine check-ins, shared conversations, emotional grounding. When the other inmate was suddenly transferred, RL described the aftermath. The tear felt empty. Not quieter, just enough. You don't realize how much someone holds you together until they're gone. There was no conflict. No romantic element. Just the everyday presence of someone who made the sentence feel survivable. When that presence vanished, the psychological vacuum was immediate. The dangerous spiral. Isolation after loss. Psychologists note 3 common phases inmates face after losing a stabilizing bond. 1. Emotional disorientation. The brain struggles to reorganize without its attachment anchor. Routines feel disrupted. Small stressors hit harder. 2. Social withdrawal. Some inmates pull back from others because forming a new bond feels risky or disloyal. 3. Increased vulnerability. Without emotional grounding, they become more sensitive to tension, conflict, or internal stress. This phase is where the real danger lies. Not violence, but psychological breakdown. Why transfers hit harder in prison psychology? In ordinary life, people move, drift, reconnect, or rebuild. In prison, rebuilding is difficult because trust is scarce. Emotional safety takes months to earn. Detachments form under high stress. Bonds are interwoven with survival. Predictability is rare. So losing someone disrupts not just the relationship, it disrupts the entire emotional architecture. And this leads to the next critical stage. Once an inmate loses a stabilizing relationship, many must rebuild from the ground up. Some recover. Some grow stronger. Some never fully replace the bond they lost. The next chapter reveals what happens when relationships evolve from survival tools into identity-shaping forces. Connections that influence behavior, worldview, and even how an inmate re-enters society. Identity shift, how prison relationships rewrite the self. Every relationship behind bars, whether it offers comfort, stability, or survival, leaves an imprint on the mind. But some connections don't just help inmates cope. They reshape who they become. According to the NIJ, APA, and long-term research by Dr. Craig Haney, confinement environments don't just affect behavior, they reconstruct identity. And relationships formed under pressure play a massive role in that reconstruction. Inside prison, people often redefine themselves in response to the bonds they build. The identity rewrite begins subtly. An inmate doesn't wake up one day and decide they're changed. It starts quietly, adopting someone's routines, picking up their coping strategies, mirroring their emotional patterns, internalizing their outlook on prison life, learning their calm, or their intensity, or their discipline. When two people rely on each other, the brain naturally exchanges pieces of identity. This is normal human psychology, but confinement amplifies it. Why identity shifts are stronger in prison contexts. 3 factors make prison-based identity change especially powerful. 1. Emotional compression. With limited social options, 1 or 2 people influence your emotional world far more intensely than they would on the outside. 2. Environmental uniformity. Because everything around you stays the same, internal changes stand out more. You can literally feel the shift happen. 3. Survival-based bonding. You don't just connect with someone, you navigate stress together. Shared hardship creates deep psychological alignment, documented in multiple APA studies on confined environments. Realistic nonfiction inmate story. A documented case from a correctional psychology program featured an inmate named Malachi. He explained that a stabilizing bond changed not just his routine, but how he saw himself. Before, I reacted first and thought later. The guy I got close to was the opposite. Quiet. He didn't let anything shake him. After a while, it rubbed off. I didn't even notice the change until staff told me I seemed different. This wasn't imitation. It was emotional influence under pressure. The same psychological process that shapes soldiers, firefighters, or anyone who endures high-stress environments together. The positive impact that's often overlooked. While prison relationships can create dependency, they can also push inmates toward better emotional regulation, improved coping skills, reduced impulsivity, increased patience, stronger resilience, a clearer sense of identity. NIJ reentry studies show that inmates with stable, healthy emotional connections, even platonic ones, often experience improved post-release adjustment because they learn to regulate emotions through those bonds. These stabilizing relationships don't guarantee success outside, but they often provide psychological tools that solitary coping never could. The double reality of identity changes. However, identity shifts can also carry hidden tensions. If the relationship breaks suddenly, the inmate may feel unanchored. If the person they bonded with is transferred, their coping skills may destabilize. If the bond becomes strained, their emotional growth can regress. Identity built in confinement is powerful, but sometimes fragile. This is why correctional psychologists emphasize the importance of understanding relationship dynamics during incarceration. It's not drama. It's not sensationalism. It's human adaptation. Because once an inmate's identity reshapes through these connections, there's a final psychological stage. How these relationships, formed under pressure, restriction, and survival, shape the person they become after release, or the person they must be to endure the rest of their sentence. The emotional imprint doesn't stay behind bars. It travels with them. How prison relationships follow inmates long after release. Prison ends on paper, but psychologically, parts of it follow people for years. Researchers from the NIJ, APA, and the Chicago Crime Lab confirm that relationships formed under confinement leave long-lasting emotional imprints, both stabilizing and scarring. Some inmates walk out stronger because of who helped them survive. Others walk out grieving a bond that could never exist the same way again. And many carry the psychological shape of a relationship that permanently altered how they trust, attach, and relate to the world. Brain the long shadow of confinement bonds. Prison relationships, platonic, protective, supportive, stabilizing, often affect. 1. How inmates form relationships outside. Some become more selective, craving the depth they found behind bars. Others fear attachment because losing it once hurt too much. 2. Their emotional regulation. Attachment under stress teaches coping skills, or in some cases, dependency patterns they must unlearn after release. 3. Their identity. People often walk out with traits they absorbed inside. Patience, vigilance, emotional guardedness, resilience, loyalty, introspection. These traits can help or hinder, depending on the environment they enter. For their worldview. Someone who experienced consistent emotional stability from a bond inside may see the world with more hope. Someone who lost a stabilizing connection may fear instability long after release. Puzzle piece realistic nonfiction inmate story, YouTube safe. A reentry analysis documented an inmate known as J. Walker, who maintained a stabilizing friendship during his sentence. When he was released, he noticed something unexpected. The outside world felt loud. People rushed everything. Inside, that one bond kept me level. Out here, I had to learn how to feel safe without it. He didn't regret the connection, but he realized it rewired him, and that he had to build new emotional foundations beyond the walls. Magnifying glass tilted left, the final psychological truth. Prison relationships aren't strange or dramatic. They're human. They reveal what happens when scarcity, confinement, and emotional pressure reshape the way people connect. Behind the stereotypes and myths, these relationships show us something universal. Humans will always seek connection, even in the harshest environments. And those connections will always change us. Thank you for stepping inside the hidden emotional world that few people ever see with honesty or depth. If you want more documentaries that explore the psychology, the reality, and the human truth behind life inside the system, make sure you like this video so YouTube shows it to more people. Drop a comment to share your thoughts or your own experiences. Your voice shapes the next episode. And most importantly, subscribe to the channel, because the next documentary is already being researched, and you won't want to miss how deep we go next. Your support helps keep these stories real, respectful, and psychologically accurate.